It all started with Ansel Keys.
Yes.
So, getting in today to the
There's the
seven
book.
countries study.
There's the
Here's
book.
here's my version. Here's my copy. The seven countries study. It just let's take a moment to appreciate the size of this.
Oh
Make
my
sure my
gosh,
thing
dude.
doesn't fall out. Just take a moment, right?
Jeez.
And I was gonna grab my Bible that's about the same size. So the Bible that I have is this same height by width, right? So
Yep.
two-dimensional.
Yep.
And then when you turn it to the side, it only extends about the thickness of the cover
Hmm.
past each side of this. So this seven country study, the 10-year results published here in 1980, is the size of a Bible.
Yes. Yes.
We're going to talk about what this study was, what it did, and then go into a lot of the critiques. And so many of the critics of the dietary guidelines and opposition to red meat and whatnot will usually start with the phrase, "It all started with Ansel Keys and the seven countries study." So a little bit about the seven country study. What exactly was it? So this was pioneering research at the time. Nothing like it had ever been done before. We had just started to dip our toes into the world of multi-country epidemiology. However, we didn't really have anything quite like what the seven country study was. So this was a prospective study, which means we started out with people who were relatively free from the diseases we were looking at, so coronary heart disease in particular, and mortality from coronary heart disease, to get even more granular. And it looked at men aged 45 to 59. And if we remember for LA Veterans Trial and our meta analysis, under 65,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So the men were ages 45 to 59, and they were in several countries. Now it says seven countries, but what it actually was 16 cohorts. So there was about 13,000 men all in total, and they were only men. It was 12,760 some, but about 13,000. And they were spread out through 16 cohorts. Now, what this was not was an N of 13,000. It was an N of 16. All right. So all in all, even though there were a lot of participants, it really was relatively small sample size. We really only had 16 samples that we were choosing from. And so countries were chosen. We're going to get into this. So the cohorts were chosen for different reasons. Most of it just had to do with funding and which researchers in which country offered to do the thing. All right. And so within each cohort, there were sub cohorts, which those were the ones that where they had their diets assessed. And the way they did that was 7-day weighed and measured food logs. So they weighed and measured everything they ate for 7 days. And then they also had sample collection, which was turned into a lab for chemical analysis. So whatever they ate, so if they had eggs with butter and cheese in the morning, they took little samples of the eggs, the butter, and the cheese. They put it into vials or test tubes or whatever, and the researchers would come and collect those. They would freeze dry it, and then they would send it to a lab for chemical analysis. So in terms of the way we'd think about a prospective cohort where we would take food frequency questionnaires and kind of give them to everybody, and then we would take add them all up, and we would take the mean and look at the low compared to the high, and that way gives us a large overview of what's happening within the cohort, but it doesn't provide a lot of accuracy or precision. The way they did it in the 7-country study, we don't get that large overview that we have the way that we do prospective cohort studies now. But what it did give us was that accuracy and precision. So the 7-country study is an ongoing, I think it's still ongoing. It's an ongoing thing. And you can actually go to 7countrystudy.com and you can look up all of this information. You don't have to. So you can buy this book on Amazon for $80. Or you can come to the 7countrystudy.com here and you can get the main highlights and everything. So the main hypothesis for the 7-country study was that the rates of coronary disease within different populations and within individuals would vary in relation to their physical characteristics and lifestyle, particularly in fat composition of the diet and serum cholesterol levels. And up to this point in time, we had a lot of research indicating that the amount of fat within the diet and to some degree the type of fat could raise or lower cholesterol levels, and we were starting to see some association between cholesterol levels and mortality from cardiovascular diseases. So it wasn't really fleshed out at this point, but all of that research up until then is kind of what led to the hypothesis and the initiation of the 7-country study. Now, before they started the 7-country study, they ran some pilot trials, and they did this in Italy, Spain, South Africa, and Japan. Did it from 1952 to 1956. And these pilot trials are where they figured out, not only from the pilot trials, but from other stuff before we're going to talk a little bit about, is that there really wasn't a standardized way of measuring all of these things. So up until this point, we kind of had FAO, food availability data, or food disappearance data, and that's kind of how we evaluated how much of what people were eating. And then the way that different countries were reporting cardiovascular disease or mortality from different things was different from country to country. Mm-hmm. So as they did these pilot studies, they figured out we need to standardize how we're measuring all of these things, mm-hmm. right? And so that through these pilot trials is how we get the way that we do a lot of our research today through standardization. All right. So getting into that's the 7-country study, and what they ended up finding was that there were certain predictive values, things that we now call risk factors, for which we could predict someone's risk of mortality or risk of developing cardiovascular disease from these specific variables. The 7-country study never inferred causality from any one of these risk factors. There's nowhere within this book or within the webpage that says the 7-country study found that X causes Y. It's not in there. It's not. It isn't there. All right.
Although some people say it is. Oh, the 7-country study found.
Yep, some people say it is. So let's talk about some of the things that people are saying. So the biggest one you'll hear is that the 7-country study is junk because Ancel Keys cherry-picked his countries to produce his desired results. All right, and then what you'll often see referred to is a chart that has 6 countries, which looks like this. Or we'll see a chart with 22 countries that looks like this. So let's talk about the 6 countries chart. So this 6 countries chart comes from a larger paper that was written by Ancel Keys, and it was a presentation that he held at Mount Sinai Hospital at a symposium. And his initial hypothesis, this chart with these 6 countries, was that there was some association with total fat and mortality from degenerative heart disease. So you can see it here, figure 2, mortality from degenerative heart disease. And these were different hospital codes that were listed for basically CHD and CVD mortality, mm-hmm. right? So this presentation and this paper that he had, that this chart, the 6 countries chart comes from, came from a paper that was more than 20 pages long and had about 15 different charts and graphs. It was a very wide-ranging talk that he gave. And his initial hypothesis before the 7-country study was that total fat probably played some part in what we were seeing in the mortality from degenerative heart disease. He later changed that. So once he started getting better data, as 7-country study data started coming in, he changed the hypothesis to that wasn't so much total fat, but composition of fat and a few other things. All right. So the 6-country study. Now, people will say he left out Canada, Australia, England, and Wales out of the 7-country study, even though he had this data for it. So, but the reason that he chose these 6 countries for this presentation at the symposium was because these were the 6 countries for which data was the most reliable at the time. So we have to think about, so this degenerative heart disease is in men 1948 through 1949. Well, what happened in the world shortly, prior to this time period was World War II. Yeah. Yep. So a lot of the other countries within the world, particularly Europe and parts of North Africa, the data that they had on heart disease, mortality, and diet intake was just not that great, right? Yeah. Because you had Nazi occupation of a lot of that part of the world at this time. A lot of records were destroyed. So, why did he choose these 6? Because these were the ones that had the best data to show from. This chart and this data is not from the 7-country study. Now, the other thing people go into is this 22 countries. So they'll say that at the time Keyes was selecting trials, we had data for 22 countries, and people will point to this paper by Yerushalmi and Hilleboe. Go to this one, and it is this one, Fat in the Diet and Mortality from Heart Disease by J. Yerushalmi and Herman E. Hilleboe. And in this study, they looked at 22 countries for which there was food availability data from the FAO, and we had mortality data on a whole bunch of different causes of death. Now, again, why did Keyes choose the 6 countries that he did? Because of the reliability of the data. So this paper that Yerushalmi and Hilleboe, they attended Keyes' presentation at the symposium, and they really took issue with that one chart. So this entire paper that they wrote here is not in response to Keyes' entire presentation, but only to this one chart that had the 6 countries on it.
Now, I want to throw something at you just for a second.
Sure.
And go back to that chart, and then I'm going to flip back to the 22 countries.
Okay.
So look at that. Look at the generalization. Look at the curve.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now throw the 22 country on there. Okay. Am I the only one that sees the correlation?
Nope, you are quite astute. So let's get into that. Mm-hmm. All right. So they wrote this paper basically in response to this one chart that Keyes threw up there, right? And so they went on to write this paper. Now, Yerushalmi and Hilleboe were actually statisticians. So the people who cite this Yerushalmi and Hilleboe, they'll often say, well, Keyes showed these 6 countries, right? And then you also have the 7 countries study data. But when you look at the 22 countries, when we throw all that in, this correlation between fat in the diet and heart disease goes away. But as you've astutely pointed out, Dwayne, and you're not the only one, there are many of us who say, I'm sorry, but this looks like it goes up and to the right.
Yeah, 22 is the United States.
22 is the United States, yeah. And so on the bottom, on the x-axis here, we have fat calories. That's a percent of total calories, going all the way up to 40%. And then the death rates per 100,000. And so the United States eating a lot of fat in the diet at the time, we had a lot of heart disease. All right. And so Finland over here, number 7, they were slightly less, around 30%. They had a lot of heart disease too. Number 1, Australia. Number 3, Canada. and nothing's really changed today except Finland. Through
Mhm.
there, we talked about the North Karelia project. They've
Yeah,
really
yeah,
brought their heart disease down, so they're
yeah,
quite down here, and their fat would be over here. But they still fall in line with this trajectory, right?
right.
All right. So Yerushalmi and Hillebo, this paper actually inadvertently corroborated Keyes's later findings in the 7-country study. And this paper was published in 1957. But during that time, the 7-country study was already collecting baseline data. They had already selected their cohorts, and they were already in the process of collecting baseline data from the men that were participating in the cohorts. Numerous countries within the 22 countries that they have listed here in that chart were influenced by World War II and Nazi-occupied Germany, particularly Norway, Netherlands, France, Denmark, Greece, all of which Keyes addressed in his 6 countries chart. All right. And we're going to talk about this little thing here in a minute. And so the explanation of cohort selection is in the introduction of the 7-country study. And 7 of the 16 cohorts had either no data or low quality data for either diet or coronary heart disease or both. So let's take a look. So these are photos from my little book here. Selection of areas. So within Italy, we can see that there was an absence of any detailed information about the incidence of disease, the diet, and the characteristics of the men for Crevellacourt and Montegigorio. Not sure about that. All right. So we have 2 cohorts in Italy, which we had an absence of any detailed information about disease or diet. Then in Dalmatia and Slavonia, almost nothing was known about the incidence of coronary heart disease and other diseases. So we have 2 cohorts in Dalmatia and Slovenia where we don't have disease or data for disease. We have in Greece, the cohort in Crete, there was no reliable data on the incidence of coronary heart disease. So 1 in Greece. And then we have here in Belgrade and Serbia, because little was known of the frequency of coronary heart disease or the character of the diet, these variables were not involved in the selection of the areas in Serbia. So we have 2 in Serbia, 1 in Greece, 2 in Italy, and 2 in, I think it was Yugoslavia, right? Dalmatia and Slovenia.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's 7. So Dwayne, let me ask you this question. If you were designing the 7-country study and you wanted to cherry pick countries to prove your hypothesis true, would you pick any countries for which you had no data?
Nope, absolutely
No.
not.
But we have 7 out of the 16, almost half the cohorts for which we don't have reliable data or any data for some of them. And just fantastic. Let me see if I can zoom in. So the last sentence in this section on areas of selection, remember, this is written well before any of the modern anti-7-country study, anti-dietary guidelines people have had any objection to offer. This was written well before that. And I quote, "The foregoing information about the selection of the areas for the 7-country study is offered to counter unfounded suggestions that the cohorts were chosen on the basis of prior knowledge that promised to support a hypothesis of a causal link between diet and incidence of coronary heart disease." So people who will object to results from the 7-country study on the basis that it's biased because of areas of selection just clearly didn't even bother to read the introduction.
Wow.
I mean, It is literally like on page 3 or 4.
This is like 1950, what, 7 you said maybe?
Well, the start of the study. So this is the 10-year data reporting. This would have been
60.
This was released in 1980, so he probably would have started writing this in the early to late 70s.
Yeah. So that's a beautiful line. Look, man, so many of the studies that we look at in this podcast If they would just write that,
Right.
jeez, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
it's right there to see. All right. So on the basis of cherry picking countries, um, no. Now I know that I've seen Nina Teicholz. She's a big name out there in the low carb world, high fat, high red meat, all that stuff. She said, well, Keyes didn't purposely pick any studies which would have went against his hypothesis, de facto presenting bias in the study. However, that's not true because we have all of these areas for which no diet data was known, right? And then if we go back in here, let me go to the first page. Let's look at Japan was a natural selection because of all the countries with anything like credible vital statistics that seem to be the lowest in coronary heart disease. The compelling practical reason was that Noboru Kimura, who had once worked with us in Minnesota, offered enthusiastic help at little cost. The farming village of Tanushimaru and the fishing village of Yushibuka were selected because local physicians in those areas offered to help. So why was Japan selected? Just basically because the people offered to help. There's no other reason other than that.
Wow, it really kind of boils my chili when somebody said, "Well, he didn't choose this because this." Why did you talk to him? Did
Right.
you sit down and ask him? No.
Yeah, and if we go back to this 22 country study and we look at the data on some of this stuff, I don't know if Japan is 13, so it's right here.
Yep.
And the United States is number
Right
one.
there.
We have East Finland number one.
Yeah.
And we have all of this stuff in between. Now, Finland, not France, Italy,
Mexico's 14 down there at the bottom.
Mexico. Yeah. So in the 7 country study, as they selected, we had Finland and the United States way, way, way up here in their total fat intake and death from coronary heart disease. And then we have Japan way down at the bottom. And then we have everything in between. So there's no bias being de facto introduced because you have the lowest fat with the lowest coronary heart disease and the highest fat with the highest coronary heart disease. And then you have all these countries in between. Now, certain countries, we saw that in the pilot trials, both Spain and Africa, I can't remember if it was North Africa, South Africa, had participated in the pilot trials within those countries. Now, Spain and Africa were not in the 7-country study. We'll talk about why. Let's get into the Greek cohorts. So objections to some of this stuff is that, well, surveys conducted in the Greek cohorts, some of them were conducted during Lent. And that would artificially show lower saturated fat intake or total fat intake because Lent requires fasting, and particularly fasting of meat. And so the critique here is that, well, look how dumb Ansel Keys was and these researchers, that they selected Greek as a cohort and they were, taking food records during this time period where they weren't eating any meat, and that would cause issues. You would have confounding in there. However, the 7-country researchers were aware of this, and they purposely evaluated seasonal differences to see if there was any effect on the diet over the course of the year. So we're going to come to another little sub-paper of the 7-country study. And let's just look here. Seasonal variability. This paper is written by Ansel Keys, by the way. The dietary changes prescribed for Lent by the Roman Catholic Church, or more so by the Greek Orthodox Church, are also important. The Greek Orthodox rules are much more strict than Roman Catholic, and the church and the fasting period of 8 weeks should theoretically have a major impact on the total diet for the year. However, as will be shown in the report on dietary studies in Greece, actual practice is different from church prescription. On the island of Corfu, some farming families made concessions to church rules and tradition during the fasting period in 1963, but the average effect on the total diet was trivial. Not only were total calories substantially unaffected, the percentage of calories from proteins and from animal fat were not significantly different in the fasting period than in a non-fasting period when the same families were studied. In spite of the foregoing indications that seasonal variation in the diet are often only small, it goes without saying that assumptions about populations not previously studied are always potentially unsafe. Proper characterization of the diet of a population requires dietary surveys repeated in several seasons of the year.
Well done. Well done.
Yeah. So they were aware of Lent. They were also
Well
aware that within portions of the world, you have seasonal variations where certain fruits are going to be available, certain vegetables are going to be available. Food overall availability is going to decline in the wintertime. They were aware of this. So throughout these 5-year periods of data collection. That's how the 7 country study data was collected, is in periods of 5 years, all the way up to 25 years. And then after that, I think it just went to 50. All right. So, but they were aware of that. So in 1 year, they would take data collection, diet collection at one time of the year. And then the next time they would do it at a different time of the year. And the next time they would do it at a different time of the year because they wanted to see how different seasons affected the overall look on the diet.
This is one of my favorite studies. It's just so well done.
It's good. Yeah. All right. So we can see sources of calories in the diets of the men in Crete and Corfu. Now, Lent is some time period between March and April. All right. So in Crete in 1965, some portion of this February diet sampling was taken during Lent. And then in Corfu, we have this period between March and April in 1963. That's what would have been taken. All right. And we can see that the calories from animal protein didn't really change at all. It actually went up during Lent in Crete, right? And no difference really in Corfu. And then the calories as a percent of total daily intake for animal fat really didn't change, except it went up in Crete during Lent, and it was the same in Corfu. So
isn't that weird?
The idea that Lent actually had an impact, and who's to say that these people weren't fasting during the day and then just making up for it at night? So either they were doing that or they just weren't that adherent to,
Church
the
practices.
church prescription.
Right.
All right. And so this is also, these 7 days. Oh, this also, they have a chemical analysis too. Let me go down and find this. Yeah. So here we have the table. So this is the dietary reporting by the men. So they're weighed and measured food logs. And then you actually have the chemical analysis. So we have it for calories, we have it for percentage of protein, and then we have it for percentage of fat. And percentage of protein, you can see like all of these, it's fairly similar. It's not that much different than what the men reported. There's differences in the percentage of fat between what the men reported and the chemical analysis. However, the researchers doing the chemical analysis noted that some of the fat was adhering to the sides of the test tube, so that probably accounts for the discrepancy between what's reported and what was submitted for chemical analysis, because some of the fat within that food was lost. It just stuck to the sides of the tubes and stuff. Let's talk about the French paradox. So there's talk that the France was excluded specifically because it didn't fit Ancel Keys' hypothesis, right? This is one of those things, well, he should have selected France because of something known as the French paradox. And this paradox is just that the French tend to eat a diet that is, higher in saturated fat. However, they have relatively low amounts of coronary heart disease. Now, France actually did participate in the pilot trial. So several of their researchers participated in Italy, where they were performing these pilot trials, figuring out how to conduct the 7-country study and data acquisition and all of that stuff. And the French representative was named Dr. Jacques Carlotti. He went on to actually participate in the 7-country study. So he was a representative from France. He participated in one of the cohorts in Italy. All right. France ultimately decided to opt out due to lack of funding or a lack of interest. And we have the same thing. We saw that Spain and Africa were in the pilot
Hmm.
trial. However, they were not in the 7-country study,
Hmm.
and also Sweden and a couple other countries, right? So the 7-country study wasn't funded out of Minnesota. The 7-country study was funded by each country and specifically by each town, or area where those cohorts were in. So Ansel Keys didn't send a whole bunch of American researchers out to these different countries to take over. You actually had researchers from within the country who were conducting research on their own countrymen, and the countries themselves opted to engage or to participate in the 7-country study. They had to pay their own way. And so sometimes, we're looking at a time period after World War II where there's economic instability. A lot of countries just didn't have funding to participate in a 25-year trial. Now, the idea of the French paradox here, again, it's that the French eat a diet high in saturated fat, but are lower in heart disease. This concept of a French paradox didn't even exist in the literature until 1981.
Wow.
That would be 1 year after this
Yeah.
was released. This
Mm.
was first used in a paper by a French epidemiologist, J.L. Ricard, describing heart disease in French policemen. Now, interestingly enough, Urenshami and Hilleboe showed the French during the time of the 7-country study actually ate a low-fat diet. So let's go back to this. So France is number 8.
Hmm.
This little dot right here. As a percent of calories they were consuming, right in this chart. So this is a big all-inclusive chart here for the hospital category B26, mortality from arteriosclerotic and degenerative heart disease. So they're under 30% of calories at the time and showing relatively low rates of heart disease, right? But remember, Urashami and Hilleboe were statisticians. All right. So as we get a little more granular in things here, we're looking at this chart on the left, fat calories as a percent of total calories. And then we have the combined B26 and B27. So this would be mortality from arteriosclerotic and degenerative heart diseases. Who comes up with these words?
It's huge.
And then B27, that hospital code is other diseases of the heart. Okay, so they've included 2 categories here. And so as we see here, the French number 8 is somewhere around 25%. So during the time where we had availability on food data of these 22 countries, which people are saying, well, he cherry picked and he excluded France because they were eating a high fat, high saturated fat diet. They were actually eating somewhere between 25 and 30% of their daily calories as diet. Dwayne, you have any recollection of what the current dietary guidelines recommend for total fat intake?
No, it seems like 20%.
It's less than 30.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
around 30. So during the time that Urashami and Hilleboe wrote this paper on these 22 countries, the French were consuming a diet with a total fat content that falls right in line with what our current dietary recommendations are.
Right.
All right.
Beautiful.
And then as we can see, once we included this B27, we see that their mortality from heart disease bumped up a little bit here. And again, if we take a line and we point it right through, this isn't scientific, but we just point it right through this cluster of dots here, it goes up and to the right.
Yeah.
All right. Now, interestingly here, Urashami and Hilleboe looked at animal protein calories as a percent in correlation with these mortality from heart diseases. And what did they find? They found an even better correlation from animal protein.
Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah. And then that goes into this chart up here as well. All right. We'll come back to that. But let's look at France. All right. So mortality from the 22 country heart diseases for males, if we look at France, or I'm sorry, France right here. I highlighted the wrong one. All right.
Okay,
So France is number 8. And their age-adjusted mortality is 319. The United States was 22, and it was 729. All right. Now, interestingly enough here, France, number 8, the calories per person per day from protein, 188 calories. From total fat, 810. Now we've separated this, they've separated this to vegetable and animal. And in regards to how much animal fat the French was consuming, which would be our proxy for saturated fat, they have no data on that.
Yep. Blank.
Blank. And let's just take do some quick math here. So 810 calories, 9 calories per gram, is about 90 grams of fat total for the day. All right. Compared to United States, where our animal protein intake was 252, much higher, and total fat was 1,215, right? And 855 of that coming from animal. And you can see clearly over here, the French had a total fat as a percentage of their total diet was around 30%, just under that. America was 40. And 28% of the diet, almost 30% of the diet was coming from animal fat, so a proxy for saturated fat intake. So this paper by Uren, Shabi, and Hillebo inadvertently disproved the idea that any French paradox actually existed during this time. The French, according to what they had available, the data that they had, were actually eating quite a low-fat diet.
Much lower than the U.S. for sure.
Much lower than the U.S. And so the data was lacking due to Nazi occupation of France during World War II. France is the only one of those 22 countries. Let me repeat that. France is the only one of the 22 countries that had no estimates for animal fats. All right. And once you include B26 and B27, so if we look back at this chart up here, we can see that for only the hospital code B26, heart disease deaths was way down here, less than 200, somewhere around 100, right? But once you included both of those, then they jumped way up here.
Over 200.
Right, for an age-adjusted average, which, although albeit it's lower than these other things, but once you include that other catch-all category, B27, we see that France falls right in line on both of these charts for a correlation between both fat calories and animal protein calories as a percentage of the diet and mortality from these heart diseases.
There's no paradox.
There was no paradox at the time. Yeah. Sugar. This is my favorite one. So critics will say the 7-country study neglected to record the deleterious effects of sugar in favor of a low-fat agenda. Now, this whole thing about Ansel Keys and low-fat, Ansel Keys promoted the Mediterranean diet, which is extremely high in olive oil, fatty fish, and dairy products like cheese and milk, particularly hard cheeses. Okay. By no means is that a low-fat diet. All right. They'll say regression analysis did not adjust for sugar as a confounder. And later analysis found that sugar had a higher correlation. But 7-country study researchers did record and did report that sugar was positively associated with coronary heart disease. So let's go back to the book. So here we have it. The 10-year incident rate of coronary heart disease was significantly correlated with the percentage of calories supplied by sucrose in the average diets of the cohorts. However, as found in the analysis of the 5-year follow-up data, the correlation is accounted for by the intercorrelation of sucrose with saturated fatty acids. Now, yeah.
Wow.
All right. So they did find that sugar was associated with coronary heart disease. However, it only associated with coronary heart disease in so much as that it associated with saturated fat in the diet. So really what they found was that sugar correlated with heart disease when it was included in foods like pastries and cakes and things like that. And so as they did their subgroup analyses once they looked at the diet and they held saturated fat constant and they removed sugar from it, the correlation between saturated fat and coronary heart disease remained. But if they held sugar constant and they removed saturated fat from it, that correlation went away. It dropped significantly, right? To have an R of 0.13. Whereas when they did it the other way for saturated fat, it held at 0.62. So they actually did look at sugar and they found that it did in fact correlate with heart disease. It's just that saturated fat correlated more significantly with heart disease. There's a problem at the time is that we didn't really have much in the way of a plausible mechanism for explaining how sugar would impact coronary heart disease the way that we do today. All right. There's also a problem is that, and this goes the same with smoking, is that the amount of sugar consumed per individual and per population didn't really seem to be that much different. So there wouldn't be a large effect to be found because the amount consumed was relatively the same between all cohorts. This is before what we have, known as a standard American diet or a Western diet. That didn't exist at the time. So all of these cohorts, people were relatively consuming about the same amount of sugar. So there just wasn't enough variation to find a large signal in the noise. All right. But if we go to the 7-country study website here, we have 25-year and 50-year follow-up data. And if we look at the 50-year follow-up data for sucrose, we can see that as we've collected data for 50 years on these cohorts, right, and we have better understandings of sugar and a quote-unquote Western diet has increased across the globe and many of these populations are eating it, we see that the correlation between sugar and heart disease is much higher now after 50 years of data than it was back then, right? An R of 0.71. That's a high correlation. But if we look at the 50-year data on saturated fat and heart disease, it's an R of 0.92. So saturated fat still, all right, and these charts are a good way to show what these correlation numbers mean. So as we see this dotted line rise up, so this correlation coefficient, this number indicates to us how tightly all these points are to that line. All right. And really the only thing throwing this off from being, like 0.98 or 0.99 is we have East Finland is way off here. The US, if that could be a little tighter, and West Finland, if that was a little tighter, that would drive that correlation coefficient to 0.98 or 0.99. However, a correlation coefficient of a 0.92, remember this only goes to 1. Correlation coefficient is between 1 and -1, 1 being perfect correlation. All these dots would fall right on that line at 1. So 0.92 is
pretty amazing, actually.
Pretty amazing. That's amazing. Pretty high correlation. All right. So 7-country study did in fact report on sugar. They did collect sugar intake. And, the reason that there aren't a whole bunch of charts and an entire section dedicated to sugar is not because they were trying to hide something. It's just because that there wasn't that much to report. They just, hey, we found a correlation, but once we adjusted for saturated fat, the correlation went away. Yeah. That's it. Smoking. Now, this one is odd. So I've had Kate Shanahan. I talked to her on X. Well, I basically troll her, but that's neither here nor there. But she talked about the 7-country study at one point in one of her posts, and I basically refuted her. And she said, well, but Ancel Keys ignored all of this smoking data that he was getting from the 7-country study. Now, the same thing with smoking that goes with the sugar is that, remember, this is a time period before we knew smoking was bad. and it was pretty widespread. So the majority of the men within these cohorts basically all had the same rates of smoking. So there just wasn't a large enough disparity between non-smokers and smokers, or, you know, anywhere between 20 cigarettes a day to 0 cigarettes a day. There just wasn't enough there to find a major correlation. All right. But there is an entire section within this report that is dedicated to smoking. All right. So we can see chapter 9 here, smoking habits. There's an entire
Wow.
chapter dedicated to smoking habits. All right. And as we can see, we look at the percent of men smoking 20 more cigarettes a day and their 10-year death rates per 1,000. Our correlation coefficient is 0.003. Now, look at this chart, this scatter of dots here, right? And a correlation. So this line, if we had a correlation, it would basically be flat, right? Showing no correlation. And we go back to this. When people say when we added these 22 countries, the correlation between fat intake and heart disease went away. This goes up and to the right. And
This does
is
not.
all over the place. All right. And again, we can see here percentage of men who were non-smokers and their death rates. The correlation was a negative 0.19. Again, you know, it just, they're kind of clustered up in the middle here. It's basically flat. It might go down a little bit. We have percentage of men smoking 20 or more cigarettes daily. And this was 10-year coronary heart disease cases. Correlation coefficient negative 0.03, and this, again, it's flat. So there just wasn't enough variation between people to find anything. However, what they did find was that for certain countries, so we have here West Finland and Zutphen, we can see that if you go from never smokers to over 20 cigarettes a day, that there was, you know, kind of this stepwise increase in coronary heart disease deaths. However, we had other countries like Dalmatia and Slovenia here, where it's like from never smokers to all the way up to 19 cigarettes a day. There just wasn't that much of a change, right? So that's what they found for smoking. And it's, you know, again, it's not that anybody ignored data. It's just there wasn't a large enough variation in smoking at the time to find anything. However, at the end of the day, the 7-country study ultimately deemed smoking to be a risk factor. Okay, the 7-country study does not endorse smoking. Putting that
Although
to bed.
people have said that it did.
People have said that it did.
Yeah.
All right, and let's come back to this. Oh, did I stop the share? Let's come back to this Yerushalmi and Hillebo paper, and we're going to look at this because people love to cite this thing. All right, this 22 country study. Well, he cherry picked it. We had data on 22 countries that showed there's no correlation. When we actually go to the tables, so we have the charts and we can just visually see that line goes up and to the right. We actually have the charts here, okay? And so when we see the correlation coefficients between various dietary components and death rates for different groupings of categories of diseases of the heart in 22 countries, we see in green, these are positive associations, and in blue, these are negative associations. So total calories, positively associated with heart disease. Mortality, all right, death from heart diseases. Calories from fat, all the way across, positively associated.
Mhm.
Animal fat, positively associated. Vegetable fat, negatively associated. Calories from protein, positively associated. We split that up into animal or vegetable. Animal is positively associated. Vegetable is negatively associated. Calories from carbohydrate, positively associated. However, when we look at the percent of total calories, so this is the number of calories. When we look at the percent of calories for that carbohydrate as a percentage of the diet, we find it has a negative correlation. Vegetable protein, negative correlation. Animal protein, positive correlation. Vegetable fat, negative correlation. Animal fat, positive correlation. So even this 22 country study where people say that this relationship between fat and heart disease went away refutes that idea. This Yerushalmi and Hillebo paper actually confirms or adds on to what we found in the 7-country study. It does not refute it.
Let's cook in that beef tallow.
It's hard. I mean,
shots fired.
yeah. You know, a lot of people, I've had to change my mind on a lot of this stuff, right? But as we've gone through now, Dwayne, we're going on a year and a half through this podcast, right? And we continue to look at all of these things. We look at these studies where people say, ha, here you go, this disproves it. And we look at it and we say, no, this actually proves it. And it's hard to, the amount of data that we have regarding fats from animals versus fats from vegetables and their impact on coronary heart disease, or, you know, the relationship between there. The amount of evidence is overwhelming in that direction. And it was, you know, it's a hard pill to swallow.
Yes.
So going to the 7-country study, what was it? You know, it's a landmark trial that really set the stage for what we now know today to be epidemiological nutrition research. There was nothing like it for nutrition at the time. They figured out that we had to standardize the way we collect data for diet and heart disease and mortality and all these different things. And it's not a perfect study. It's hard to say that it's even an epidemiological study. It is prospective in nature. However, it really is more ecological. It's you know, we just are kind of comparing things against one another, and we don't really have the high versus low or split up into quintiles or tertiles or the way that we have in modern studies today. But for what it was, this was pioneering research. All right. And it gave us an indication of where to start looking regarding how to solve this problem of increasing death from coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease. So is it a perfect study? By no means is it a perfect study. It has lots of flaws. Okay. It's a huge monumental undertaking. But at this point, you know, it's not just some short thing that was, you know, done for 5 or 10 years and then over with. We have 50 years of data on it at this point. So critiques of the initial, you know, 5-10 year reports or the way it was conducted in the beginning, blah, blah, blah. You just have to ignore 50 years worth of data in order to have those critiques. And you also have to just not read the thing or interact with any of the published research on it. So,
yeah, I don't feel called to read the book because
no, I haven't read
my best friend has the book, and you know, I trust that. But of all the studies that we've gone through, that I think that you can agree that I can be very critical of how studies are done, how the trials, how the, you know, blind cohorts or double blind and all of those things. But the one thing I like about the 7 countries, and yeah, I mean, I'm not an Ansel Keys fanboy, but even if that was a word back then, I'm not sure. But his transparency in, okay, this didn't happen. We didn't do this because of this. I mean, he's just transparent from the beginning, which lends just a lot of validity and integrity to the study. Plus the 25-year and the 50-year data is just one of my favorites.
Yeah,
just saying.
It's there. And by no means did they say, hey, these things are causing. They simply said, look, these are risk factors. We can't say that this is causing it. We can't say X is causing Y. We don't have the data to do that, but this certainly is a risk factor. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So there's a 7-country study. Take that and go forward when you see critiques of it or people who try to admonish it online. And it's very clear. You'll see, you're going to see it in arguments. It's very clear they have not read it. They have not interacted with it at all. So hope this helped you guys, and hope some minds were blown. We'll see you next time. Coach Lambie and Dwayne out.
See you guys.